My name is Lawrence Denton. I'm 42 years old, and for most of my life I wore two masks, one of quiet obedience and one of unshakable patience. I started working in logistics when I was just 19, back when my father told me, "Stay invisible and you'll stay employed." That lesson got me through years of being overlooked, dismissed and underestimated, even by the people who were supposed to love me most. My family, especially my nephew, Carter, who strutted into every room like he invented success, and my younger sister, Diane, who used to call me the dependable background noise. I never asked for much, but I paid attention. I always paid attention. The real story begins in a hotel ballroom just outside Houston. It was supposed to be a family business summit, a gathering to chart the future of our small but growing freight and supply chain consulting company. Except when I arrived, my name wasn't on the seating chart. My chair had been removed from the table. My nephew's assistant greeted me with an apologetic glance and pointed to a dusty metal chair in the back, near a pile of vendor boxes and unused signage. "There was a mix-up," she said, but the look on Carter's face when he stood at the front of the room, smirking, told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a mistake, this was a message. For years, I'd quietly managed the core contracts, built the client relationships, and kept the logistics running through hurricanes, price surges, and labor strikes. But Carter was flashier. He was the Instagram CEO, all blazers and buzzwords. Diane, who used to call me when her rent was overdue, now referred to me in meetings as Uncle Larry, like I was the family mascot, not the foundation. When the catering arrived and they passed hors d'oeuvre over my head without even acknowledging me, something inside me didn't burn, it froze. I felt the chill of clarity, and I remembered something they'd all forgotten. This company didn't start with them. 15 years ago, I invested my entire retirement into saving the business after my father passed. While Carter was still trying to decide if he wanted to be a DJ or a real estate agent, I negotiated deals that put us back on the map. But I'd never demanded credit. I'd stayed in the shadows, on purpose. I held the largest share quietly through a trust, under a different name, a structure set up long before they even thought to care. I didn't need them to know I was the majority owner, until now. When Carter took the mic and said, "From here on out, we're going lean, new leadership, new blood, and no room for dead weight," everyone clapped, except me. I sat there in that folding chair, unmoved, watching, studying. Carter grinned like a wolf in front of sheep, but he didn't realize I had the legal teeth to take back everything he thought he controlled. That day they put me in storage, but they had no idea I owned the building. In that moment I decided I wouldn't yell, I wouldn't protest, I wouldn't try to earn back a seat at their table. Instead, I would quietly begin what I'd spent my whole life preparing for. My silent return, one document at a time. I didn't go home that evening angry. I went home quiet, and that kind of silence is what people like Carter never recognize as dangerous. They assume that if you're not reacting, you're irrelevant. But I've always believed that people who need to be loud rarely hold real power. So I poured myself a glass of water, opened the drawer where I kept all the trust documents and shareholder records, and laid everything out on the dining room table. 15 years ago, when I saved the company, I didn't do it for applause. I did it because I believed in legacy. But they had turned that legacy into a brand, a spectacle, and a weapon of exclusion. That night, I thought back to every small moment I'd brushed off. Every time Diane rolled her eyes when I offered advice, every smug nod Carter gave me when I handed over reports he never read, every board meeting they moved to online only without sending me the link. The signs weren't sudden, they were surgical. A slow, deliberate erasure of my presence. They wanted to scrub me out like outdated software. But I wasn't outdated. I was the system they'd been running on the whole time. I remember watching an old home video once where Diane, just 6 years old, tried to hide the last slice of cake behind her back while insisting there's nothing left. The same expression she wore when she and Carter smiled at me during meetings, pretending I still mattered. The lies had just gotten more expensive. But beneath their fancy words and confident postures, they were still those same scared kids, trying to play house with something they didn't understand. And they were about to find out that I'd never stopped being the one who turned the lights on. But before anything, I gave myself time to grieve. Not just the betrayal, but the idea that I'd ever be seen differently by them. I realized something crucial: they never respected me because they never had to. I made it too easy to ignore me. I gave everything without ever asking for recognition. That's not generosity, that's self-erasure. And the worst part, I did it willingly, thinking that loyalty alone would earn me love. I was wrong. From that point on, I made a quiet vow: no more hoping to be seen, no more waiting for validation. If they couldn't recognize my worth, I would no longer make myself small for their comfort, and I wouldn't strike back with anger. I would simply step into my rightful place on my own terms, with their illusions still intact, until the moment I chose otherwise. So I started planning, not with vengeance but with precision. While they were busy building slideshows for investors, I was organizing the truth, quietly calling lawyers, quietly reviewing contracts, quietly preparing the moment when Carter's words, "new leadership, new blood," would come back to greet him. Not with applause, but with removal papers signed by the real majority shareholder, me. I began with the trust. Buried in a safe deposit box were the documents that made everything clear. The Denton Family Holdings Trust, created after my father passed, held 61% of the company's voting shares, and I was the sole trustee. My father may not have said much in his final years, but he knew who the real caretaker was. The shares were never under my name directly, which is why Carter and Diane overlooked them in their casual quarterly reviews. They thought they'd mapped the whole terrain, but the true foundation was invisible to them, hidden in the bedrock, with my name chiseled underneath. I didn't rush. I met with the corporate lawyer I trusted, Geraldine Marks, a woman as sharp as she was discreet. She smiled when I handed her the trust papers. "You've been holding a royal flush in a game of Go Fish," she said. I told her I wasn't looking to destroy anyone. I just wanted the respect that should have never been optional. She nodded. "Then let them walk right into it. The quieter you are, the louder the shock." So, we began reviewing Carter's recent decisions: unauthorized hires, wasteful marketing budgets, and a plan to relocate our main warehouse to a location tied to his college roommate's real estate firm. A conflict of interest wrapped in nepotism. At the next board meeting I attended without warning. No chair reserved for me, of course. Carter looked up mid-sentence when he saw me walk in, glanced at the papers in my hand, and gave a half laugh. "Uncle Larry," he said, like a stand-up comedian buying time. "Didn't know you were still coming to these." I didn't answer. I sat down, placed the trust documents on the table, and waited for silence to fall. It did. The air changed. Diane blinked twice, her hand hovering above her tablet. Carter stopped smiling. "I'll be exercising my rights as majority shareholder, effective immediately," I said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't smirk. I just handed Geraldine's notarized letters to the board secretary. No one moved. Not even Carter. It was like watching a house of cards realize it had been built on a glass table. Carter tried to recover, of course. "This feels sudden," he said, his voice faltering slightly. "We should probably talk privately, right?" But I didn't give him a lifeline. I had given my family years to recognize my value. This wasn't sudden, this was overdue. And now, I held the power they thought they'd taken from me. After the meeting, Geraldine and I walked out into the parking lot. She didn't say much, but she didn't have to. I could feel it. The tide had turned. And the best part? I hadn't yelled. I hadn't begged. I hadn't even warned them. I just let the truth do what truth always does, expose what was hidden and shift the ground beneath those who forgot who laid it. The days that followed were filled with confusion, but not mine. Carter called 3 times that week, each voicemail shorter and more desperate than the last. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The documents spoke louder than I ever could. Every policy he'd pushed, every hire he'd greenlit without board approval was now under my authority to reverse or review, and I didn't storm in and fire everyone. No, that's what they expected. I did something far worse to someone like Carter. I made him sit still while I quietly, methodically dismantled the illusion of control he had built for himself. It started with the financials. I brought in an external auditor, someone with no loyalty to either side. What we found wasn't criminal, but it was damning. Carter had been using the company account for personal travel, branding retreats that doubled as vacations, and inflated consulting fees to friends. He hadn't stolen the company, he'd simply bled it while smiling. When I presented the report at the next executive session, I didn't look at him, I let the facts hang in the air. Diane couldn't even meet my eyes. Suddenly, Carter's once loyal inner circle began to thin. A few key managers requested one-on-one meetings with me, softly realigning their loyalty. "I always respected your quiet leadership," one said. "We were just following the energy at the top. I didn't scold them, I didn't need apologies. I just listened." They were looking for a new North Star, and without lifting a finger, I had become it. Carter, on the other hand, began to unravel, not publicly. He was too proud for that, but the cracks were showing. Missed meetings, sloppy presentations, tension in his voice. When speaking to investors who now looped me into every conversation, he went from the face of the company to a shadow behind it, and I hadn't said a word to humiliate him. That's the thing about real power. It doesn't need volume, it needs direction. And I had that now in abundance. I never fired him. I gave him a new role, Special Projects Liaison, a title that meant nothing. With no team, no meetings, and no influence, he kept his salary, but not his status. Diane stepped back quietly, citing health stress. I didn't question it. I knew shame wears many masks. Letting them save face wasn't generosity. It was strategy. I wasn't after revenge. I was after correction. And they were learning painfully privately that titles can be taken, but honor must be earned. The company stabilized within 3 months. Numbers climbed again. Staff morale improved. And still, I said little. I didn't need to explain how this happened. The people who mattered already knew, and the ones who didn't, well, they were now sitting in the same silence I had once been exiled to. Carter lasted another 6 weeks before the facade crumbled completely. He stopped showing up to the office altogether, citing external consulting demands that no one ever verified. Truth was, the silence had become unbearable for him. In the past, he'd fed off applause, attention, and the sound of his own voice echoing in boardrooms that he once dominated. But now, even the interns skipped his email threads. The company newsletter removed his photo. Vendors reached out directly to me. His name, once spotlighted, now passed through lips like a warning, soft, hesitant, fading. Diane called one afternoon, her voice trembling slightly under the surface. "He's not well, Lawrence," she said, no longer calling me Larry like she used to when she thought she was above me. "He's not himself." I let the silence stretch before I answered. "He never was," I said gently. "You just liked the illusion. There was no malice in my voice, just finality. She didn't argue. Maybe for the first time in years she realized how far they'd strayed from the foundation we once built, a foundation she had tried to erase. I didn't gloat, I simply reminded her that truth, like gravity, doesn't go away when ignored. It waits. The hardest part of all of this wasn't the betrayal. It was learning how easily people can devalue what they think they've already outgrown. I wasn't flashy. I didn't post my accomplishments online. I just showed up, every day doing the work, and somehow, that quiet consistency became invisible to the people who benefited most from it. I don't blame them for being young or ambitious. I blame them for being careless. Careless with legacy, careless with trust, careless with me. Still, I didn't punish. I didn't press charges for the financial missteps. I could have. But what would that prove? I had already taken everything that mattered: their image, their influence, their illusion of being irreplaceable. What was left now was the sound of their own choices echoing back at them. That was punishment enough. Because people like Carter don't fear jail, they fear irrelevance. And that's exactly where I placed him, in a quiet corner, with no one left to clap. And yet in the wreckage of their collapse, I found something unexpected: peace. Not triumph, not pride, just a long, slow exhale. For the first time in decades, I didn't feel like I had to prove my worth to anyone. I had done what needed to be done. Not out of ego, but out of necessity, not to destroy them, but to restore myself. The company kept moving. We hired smarter, led with integrity. The staff, once fractured, began to trust again, not because of speeches, but because of consistency. And when the quarterly reports came in, with growth numbers higher than we'd seen in 5 years, I didn't celebrate publicly. I just smiled in the quiet. Because I knew this wasn't revenge. This was restoration. It's been over a year now since that meeting, the one where they tried to tuck me away like clutter. Sometimes I think back to that dusty metal chair in the corner of the ballroom, the way Carter looked past me like I was furniture, and then I remember that moment I placed the trust documents on the table, watching the color drain from his face without ever raising my voice. That's the moment I remember most, not because it was dramatic, but because it was the moment I reclaimed myself without permission, apology, or performance. These days I come into the office a little later. I don't rush. I take time in the morning, coffee on the back porch, a walk through the garden, a moment with my journal. I've started mentoring younger professionals in our field, not the ones who chase titles, but the ones who ask questions, who listen, who show up consistently. I see pieces of myself in them, and I make sure they never feel invisible. That's the legacy I care about now. Not the company, not the contracts, but the people who carry quiet strength like armor. Carter moved to another city. Diane stepped down completely. She sent me a card for my birthday this year. It didn't say much, just "I see things differently now." That was enough. I didn't need an apology, I just needed honesty. And sometimes the smallest acknowledgements mean more than grand confessions. I'm not waiting for reconciliation. I've already made peace with them, with myself, with the past. What I learned through all this is simple, but profound. Being underestimated is one of life's greatest disguises. People overlook the quiet ones, the steady ones, the ones who don't need the spotlight. But those are the people who make the real moves. We don't announce our power, we preserve it. We don't beg for respect, we embody it. And when the time is right, we don't shout. We show up with the truth in our hands and nothing left to prove. This story didn't end with a courtroom, or a screaming match, or a dramatic confrontation. It ended with something far more powerful: stillness. The kind of stillness that comes when you know who you are, what you've built, and where you're going. I didn't just take my seat back at the table. I replaced the table, I redesigned the room. And I invited in only those who could recognize the value of what's real. So, if you've ever been dismissed, overlooked, boxed away like you didn't matter, just remember this. The ones who try to bury you often forget you're a seed. Let them forget. Let them underestimate. And when the time comes, let them watch you bloom in silence. That is power. That is revenge. And that is peace.